December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. As dawn breaks over the frozen Belgian landscape, 250,000 German soldiers pour through the mist like ghosts returning from a grave the Allies thought they'd sealed shut. Their target? 80,000 unsuspecting American troops holding what everyone believed was a quiet sector. Their belief? That the Americans, soft, inexperienced, dependent on material wealth over warrior spirit, would shatter like glass under the hammer of German fury. By the time the snow stopped falling, 19,000 Americans would be dead. But Germany would learn a lesson so brutal, so absolute, that they would never, never underestimate the United States again. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, and how it broke the back of the Wehrmacht forever. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe seemed all but decided. The Allies had stormed Normandy, Paris was liberated, American, British, and Canadian forces were pressing toward the German border from the west, while the Soviets crushed the Wehrmacht from the east. Germany was supposed to be finished, but Adolf Hitler had one final, desperate card to play. He called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Punch through the Allied lines in the Ardennes, split the American and British armies, race northwest to capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. It was Germany's last offensive, their final gamble. And Hitler was betting everything on a single assumption, that the Americans were weak. German intelligence had fed this belief for months. Reports described American units as untested, their officers as inexperienced, their soldiers as too comfortable with hot meals and supply lines. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the cautious old Prussian, warned Hitler the plan was reckless. General Hasso von Manteuffel called it a stroke of genius or insanity. But Hitler was convinced. He believed the Americans lacked the German soldiers' fighting spirit, that when faced with a real blitzkrieg, they would collapse. And so, in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944, Germany hurled 250,000 men into the frozen Ardennes Forest. The Americans never saw it coming. At 5:30 a.m., the world exploded. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The barrage was so intense, so concentrated, that American soldiers, many of whom were green replacements or exhausted veterans resting in what they thought was a safe zone, were caught completely off guard. Within hours, entire American divisions were surrounded. Communications were severed. Units were cut off from their supply lines. The 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, had been in combat for less than a week. Now, 2 of its regiments were encircled on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. Over 7,000 men surrendered. It was the largest mass capitulation of American forces in the European theater. The Germans were jubilant. "See," they told each other, "the Americans break easily." But they were about to learn something that no intelligence report, no battlefield assessment, no propaganda officer could have predicted. You don't measure an army by its worst moment. You measure it by what it does next. Bastogne, a small Belgian market town at the intersection of 7 critical roads. If the Germans could take Bastogne, they could control the flow of reinforcements and supplies across the entire Ardennes. It was the linchpin of their offensive, and it was defended by 18,000 Americans, mostly from the 101st Airborne Division, who had been rushed into position with barely enough ammunition for a day's fighting. The 101st's commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was a no-nonsense artilleryman from Washington, D.C. He had no illusions about the odds. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded.
German forces outnumbered the defenders 4-1. The weather was brutal. Freezing fog grounded Allied air support. Supplies were dwindling. Medical supplies were nearly gone. On December 22nd, the Germans sent an ultimatum. It was delivered in perfect English, typed neatly on captured American paper. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation: the honorable surrender of the encircled town of Bastogne. McAuliffe read it, looked up, and said one word: "Nuts." His officers laughed. One asked, "Is that the official reply?" McAuliffe shrugged. "It's as good as any. Type it up." The Germans were baffled. "Nuts?" they asked the American messenger. "What does this mean?" The colonel delivering the message smiled coldly. "It means, go to hell." And for the next 6 days, the 101st Airborne, alongside elements of the 10th Armored Division and supporting units, held Bastogne against everything the Wehrmacht could throw at them.
They fought house to house, foxhole to foxhole. When they ran out of bandages, they tore up bed sheets. When they ran out of ammunition, they scavenged from the dead. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. Allied air support roared back into action. C-47s dropped desperately needed supplies. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German positions. And on December 26th, elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines. Bastogne was relieved. The Germans had been stopped. But Bastogne was just one piece of a much larger story. Across the entire Ardennes front, American forces, many of them inexperienced, many of them caught off guard, refused to break. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held a critical northern shoulder against 5 German divisions for 6 straight days. At St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division and remnants of the shattered 106th fought a delaying action that bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive. In the south, Patton's Third Army executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history. Pivoting 90 degrees, moving 100,000 men and their equipment through ice and snow, and launching a counterattack in less than 48 hours. Patton later called it the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed. By early January 1945, the German offensive had stalled. They had achieved tactical surprise. They had broken through the initial American lines. But they had failed to break the American will. And now, the Allies were counterattacking in force. The Germans began to retreat. Not in orderly withdrawal, but in chaotic, desperate flight. By the end of January 1945, the bulge in the Allied line had been erased. Germany had lost over 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. They had burned through their last reserves of fuel, ammunition, and armor. And they had learned, at catastrophic cost, that the American soldier was not what their propaganda had promised. One captured German officer, when asked what surprised him most, said simply, "Your soldiers, they did not run. We thought they would run." Victory came at a staggering price. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. 19,000 Americans were killed in action. Another 47,000 were wounded. Over 23,000 were captured or went missing. These were not career soldiers. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California. Many of them had been in Europe for less than a month. And yet, when the moment came, when they were surrounded, outnumbered, freezing, and running out of ammunition, they held. Private First Class Richard Brookings, 101st Airborne, later recalled, "We didn't think about being heroes. We just thought about the guy next to us. You don't want to let him down."
Sergeant John McKinley, 2nd Infantry Division. The Germans thought we were soft. They thought we'd fold. But they didn't understand we weren't fighting for some ideology. We were fighting to go home. And you'll do anything to go home. On the German side, the losses were even more catastrophic. Not just in numbers, but in capability. The Wehrmacht burned through its last reserves of trained soldiers, experienced officers, and functioning equipment. The tanks they lost at the Bulge could not be replaced. The fuel they wasted could not be replenished. And the psychological impact was irreversible. Germany had gambled everything on the assumption that the Americans were weak. They had lost. And now there was no way back. After the Bulge, the war in Europe lasted just 4 more months. But the strategic and psychological impact of the battle echoed far beyond the Ardennes. For Germany, the Bulge was a catastrophe from which they never recovered. Their last offensive capability gone. Their reserves exhausted. Their morale shattered. With the Western Front stabilized, the Allies pushed relentlessly into Germany. The Soviets, meanwhile, were closing in from the east. By April, Berlin was surrounded. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. 1 week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. But the Battle of the Bulge changed more than just the course of the war. It fundamentally altered how the world, and especially Germany, viewed the American military. After the war, captured German generals were interviewed extensively by U.S. military historians. Again and again they returned to the same theme. We underestimated the Americans. General Feld Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt admitted, "The Americans learned faster than we anticipated, and once they learned, they were formidable." General Hasso von Manteuffel, "Their material superiority was expected, but their determination, that surprised us, and their leadership improved with remarkable speed." The lessons of the Bulge shaped American military doctrine for generations. Combined arms coordination, flexibility in command, the importance of logistics, the value of air superiority, and, perhaps most importantly, never mistake initial setbacks for permanent weakness. Today, the Mardossin Memorial stands outside Bastogne, a star-shaped monument honoring the American soldiers who fought there. Every December, as snow falls on the Ardennes, people gathered to remember, not just the victory, but the price. The Battle of the Bulge was supposed to be Germany's triumphant return. Instead, it became their funeral march. Hitler had bet everything on a single assumption, that when the snow started falling and the shells started landing, the Americans would break. He was wrong, and that miscalculation cost Germany the war. The soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, the ones who held at Bastogne, who bled at Elsenborn Ridge, who refused to surrender at Saint-Vith, they didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as men doing a job, a terrible, necessary job. But in doing that job, in standing when they were supposed to fall, in fighting when they were supposed to flee, they taught the world a lesson that echoes to this day. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Never mistake preference for peace as inability to wage war. And never, ever underestimate those who fight not for conquest, but to go home.
Germany learned that lesson in the blood-soaked snow of the Ardennes. They never forgot it, and they never underestimated the Americans again.